When some neighbors reported odd disturbances around NBA legend Shaquille O'Neal's villa, the police showed up with a warrant. They soon discovered a secret tunnel under the house, but they turned pale when they saw what was inside. The usually peaceful town of Greenville was shaken by an unexpected event one sunny afternoon. The calm was abruptly shattered by the piercing wail of police sirens echoing through the streets. From their homes, curious neighbors heard the commotion growing louder. It was as if the police were on a mission, heading straight for the heart of the neighborhood. The sirens crescendoed as two police officers came into view, racing toward a grand mansion down the street. The neighbors quickly realized their destination, Shaquille O'Neal's luxurious villa. Peering through curtains and blinds, they watched in stunned silence as the police vehicle screeched to a halt, surrounding the basketball legend's home. Whispers filled the air. Why were the police at Shaq's house? Some neighbors stayed glued to their windows, while others stepped outside to get a better view of the unfolding drama. Four officers climbed out of the cars and hurried to the front door. One of them knocked loudly, his voice firm and serious. "Mr. O'Neal, please come out. We have a search warrant." Moments later, Shaq himself appeared at the door, towering over the officers, but calm. He greeted them politely, his deep voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. The neighbors watched intently as Shaq and the officers exchanged words. They noticed him nodding before stepping aside to let the police in. It was a shocking sight, but to some residents, the scene wasn't entirely surprising. For months, strange events had been occurring at Shaq's villa, things that had left the tight-knit community uneasy. In the past 3 months, the neighbors had noticed unusual patterns. Every night, precisely at midnight, large trucks would arrive at Shaq's villa and stay until the early hours of the morning. The workers, dressed in gloves and masks, moved with urgency, almost as if they were racing against time. No one knew what they were transporting or why, but the secrecy was unnerving. After the strange nighttime activities, even more peculiar events began happening during the day. At least once a week, smaller vehicles would pull up to Shaq's house, each carrying large containers. The workers moved quickly and methodically, hauling the empty containers inside and emerging moments later with them noticeably heavier. No one had the slightest idea what was being transported in and out of the villa. At first, the neighbors remained silent. The residents prided themselves on respecting each other's privacy, and they were careful not to interfere in each other's affairs. They watched quietly, observing the unusual activities at Shaq's home without uttering a word. Everyone saw it, but no one dared to question it, until things took a turn for the worse. Mysterious beams of light began emanating from Shaq's villa late at night. What could that be? The neighbors wondered, exchanging whispers and worried glances. For about 2 weeks, the strange flashes appeared, lasting only moments before disappearing. Then, an unsettling smell started spreading through the neighborhood. The stench seemed to originate near Shaq's property. But no one could definitively prove it was coming from his house. By now, the unease in the community was obvious. The incidents were becoming too much to ignore. Finally, the residents decided to act. They called a meeting and, after much discussion, agreed that a delegation of the town's most respected figures would pay Shaq a visit to address their concerns. One bright morning, the group arrived at Shaq's front door, their nerves evident but their resolve firm. When the towering former basketball star opened the door, one of them stepped forward and spoke, their tone polite yet serious. "Good day, sir. We apologize for showing up unannounced, but this is an urgent matter." Shaq, ever the gracious host, invited them inside and offered refreshments, but the visitors declined. They weren't there for pleasantries. "Mr. O'Neal," one of them began carefully, "we've noticed some strange occurrences at your residence. The other residents are growing concerned, so we wanted to check in and ask, things all right?" Their words hung in the air, heavy with tension. The neighbors held their breath, waiting for his response, unsure of what they would hear but desperate for some clarity. Shaq smiled softly and replied, "I understand your concerns, gentlemen, and I'm truly sorry for causing them. But I assure you, everything's fine. There's nothing to worry about." His voice was calm, but the unease in the air was palpable. The guests exchanged skeptical glances, clearly not convinced. They'd hoped for a more concrete explanation to quell the unease among the residents. After a moment of silence, they nodded reluctantly. "All right then, we'll leave," one of them said, rising to his feet. Shaq apologized again for the disturbance and escorted them to the door. He watched as they walked away, their figures disappearing into the evening light. Once they were out of sight, he let out a heavy sigh. The last thing he'd wanted was to attract attention to his home, but somehow he'd failed. When the men returned to the concerned residents, they relayed Shaq's assurances. Some were satisfied with the explanation and eager to move on, but others remained doubtful. Chief among them was Miss Janice, who stood out with her sharp tone and determined expression. "That's ridiculous," she exclaimed, her stern frown deepening. "Something's definitely going on over there." A low murmur rippled through the group. Many rolled their eyes or exchanged knowing looks. Miss Janice's flair for dramatics was well known, and her determination to dig into other people's business was nearly legendary. She was a wealthy woman who lived 3 houses away from Shaq. She was convinced he was hiding something sinister. Whispers of her suspicions had already begun circulating through the neighborhood: fraud, trafficking, smuggling. She didn't hold back, letting her imagination run wild as she sowed seeds of doubt among the other residents. Rumors spread quickly, carried on the wings of her relentless gossip. From her vantage point, Miss Janice had been quietly observing Shaq's house, waiting for any sign that might confirm her theories. Her distrust wasn't new, it had been forged over years of personal heartbreak. Divorced 3 times, Miss Janice had little faith in people. She believed everyone had an ulterior motive, either to take from her or to deceive her. Her first marriage had ended in betrayal. Her husband had cheated on her, and when confronted, he accused her of being too demanding and controlling. His love for her had faded, and he left to be with someone else. That bitter experience marked the beginning of her lifelong distrust, and her failed marriages only deepened her skepticism. Her second marriage ended because of her own mistakes. Scarred by the betrayal in her first marriage, she became overly suspicious of her new husband. Every text or call he received was a trigger for her paranoia. She constantly sought to uncover who was on the other end, convinced he was hiding something. Her husband, frustrated by her lack of trust, tried to address her insecurities, but she refused to listen. She was so consumed by her doubts that she falsely accused him of adultery and filed for divorce. It was only after their separation that she discovered he had been innocent all along. Miss Janice's third marriage was even shorter-lived, lasting less than a year. This time, the betrayal was real. Her husband had lied about being wealthy. When she uncovered the truth, she didn't hesitate to send him packing, furious that he had married her for her money. The experience left her disillusioned and unwilling to try marriage again. Her trust issues deepened, and her suspicions about people became almost second nature, a trait that intensified when Shaq moved into the neighborhood. From the moment he arrived, Miss Janice couldn't shake the feeling that something about Shaq was off. She made it her mission to uncover the truth, keeping a close watch on his house whenever she had the chance. She became obsessed with the trucks that came and went, straining to see what they were transporting. But her efforts were in vain. The lack of concrete evidence frustrated her endlessly, fueling her determination. When the residents decided to confront Shaq, she had been hopeful that they would finally get answers, but his vague assurances left her unsatisfied. She resolved to take matters into her own hands. Determined, she doubled down on her surveillance, keeping an even closer watch on the house. Weeks passed without any breakthroughs, and her patience began to waver. Then, one night, just as she was about to give up and head to bed, something happened. She heard raised voices coming from Shaq's property. Intrigued, she rushed out, her heart racing. In the dim light, she could make out 2 figures gesturing wildly, locked in what appeared to be an intense argument. She strained to catch their words, but most of their conversation was lost to the night. However, a snippet reached her ears: "Boss isn't going to like that. You were given specific instructions." Her frustration grew as the rest of the exchange remained unintelligible. Still, it was enough to ignite her suspicion further. They were clearly talking about something secretive, and it seemed to involve Shaq. That night, Miss Janice lay awake, piecing together what little she had heard and plotting her next move. She was more determined than ever to uncover what was really happening at Shaq's house. By morning, Miss Janice had made up her mind. She was determined to use the events of the previous night to uncover the truth about Shaq. She spent the day planning and decided to strike that evening. The NBA legend had a predictable routine. Every evening, he went on a jog, running to the end of the street and back about 7 times before finishing. That evening, Janice decided to join him. Shaq looked surprised when she suddenly appeared jogging beside him. Before he could say anything, she blurted out, "I know you're hiding something, and I'm going to find out what it is." Her voice was sharp, laced with determination. Shaq glanced at her calmly, his expression unreadable. "Of course, you're right," he replied evenly, his tone maddeningly nonchalant. His lack of reaction only fueled her frustration. She tried to provoke him further, throwing sharp words and accusations his way, hoping he'd slip up or reveal something. Shaq remained unbothered, either ignoring her jabs or offering polite warnings to be careful while jogging. Eventually, Janice realized she wasn't going anywhere. Frustrated and out of breath, she gave up and walked back to her house, fuming. As she sat down to collect her thoughts, an idea struck her. If Shaq wouldn't crack, she'd force his secrets into the open another way. Determined, she picked up her phone and made a few calls. By the time she was done, she leaned back on her couch with a satisfied smirk. Her plan was in motion, and she couldn't wait to see how it would unfold. She was certain that soon, Shaq would be exposed for who he truly was. When night fell, her plan came to life. The wail of police sirens filled the air, growing louder as they approached Shaq's house. Janice watched from her window, her heart pounding with anticipation. As the police cars pulled into Shaq's driveway, she couldn't suppress her excitement. Eager to be closer to the action, Janice stepped outside and introduced herself to one of the officers. By now, a few nosy neighbors had gathered, curious to see what was happening. Whispers and murmurs filled the air as they speculated about what might be going on. The officers knocked on Shaq's door, and he opened it with his usual calm demeanor. Janice, along with a few of the more curious neighbors, followed the police inside, determined to uncover whatever her famous neighbor had been hiding. Shaq led the group through a sprawling home, his composure unwavering despite the crowd and police presence. The anticipation was evident as they moved from room to room, everyone expecting to stumble upon some dark secret. Finally, Shaq stopped at a door and opened it, revealing a staircase leading to the basement. All eyes were on him as he motioned for them to follow. What lay below would finally reveal the truth, or so everyone thought. Everyone watched in stunned silence as Shaq stopped in front of a large, heavy door at the end of the basement. He hesitated briefly, taking a deep breath before opening it. The sight inside took everyone by surprise. The brightly lit underground tunnel revealed a massive fish pond filled with an array of fish swimming gracefully. Confusion and unease rippled through the group. This was far from what anyone had expected. A police officer glanced around, puzzled, while the neighbors exchanged wary glances. Shaq, sensing their bewilderment, began to explain. The fish pond, he revealed, had been built to provide food for the homeless shelters nearby. He produced a specific license he'd obtained from the county to grow and sell the fish, along with all the permits he'd acquired to build the pond and install the lights inside the tunnel. He described how trucks arrived each night to collect the fish, which were then prepared and delivered to the shelter by morning. The mysterious glow emanating from Shaq's underground fish pond tunnel had raised eyebrows. The tunnel's shallow depth and partially translucent sections allowed some light to escape. Additionally, the high-intensity LED grow lights used to simulate natural cycles and promote healthy fish growth were incredibly bright. As Shaq spoke, the story unfolded. He had discovered the unused tunnel beneath his property after moving in and decided to turn it into something meaningful. Seeing the struggles of the homeless in the area, particularly at the nearby shelter, he wanted to help without drawing attention to himself. This pond had become his way of making a difference. The mystery of the bad smell was addressed too. Shaq explained that contamination had once killed all the fish, leaving an unbearable odor that had lingered for days. He apologized sincerely for the discomfort it had caused the neighborhood. Shaq's decision to keep the project private stemmed from his desire to focus on the cause rather than seek recognition. He recounted meeting a homeless woman whose story had deeply affected him. She'd fled an abusive marriage and ended up on the streets with no family or support system to rely on. Her daily struggle for survival had moved Shaq to take action in his quiet way. "Wow, we're so sorry for barging in, sir. We truly apologize," the officer said, their voices tinged with regret. Shaq offered them a reassuring smile. "It's fine," he said warmly, guiding them toward the door. Miss Janice stood silent, her mind racing as she struggled to find the right words. Meanwhile, the other residents approached Shaq, their faces heavy with guilt. They expressed their apologies for doubting him and for jumping to conclusions about his actions. Shaq shook his head and waved them off gently. "I would have done the same if I were in your shoes," he said with a soft smile. "You were just looking out for your safety, and that's completely understandable." The residents slowly dispersed, heading back to their homes. Soon, it was just Shaq and Miss Janice left standing in the quiet night. I don't know what to say," Janice whispered. Shaq's smile grew. "Come by tomorrow," he said. "I want to show you something." Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked back to his house, leaving Janice standing there, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and curiosity. As she made her way home, her shock lingered. Something had shifted inside her that night. She lay awake, replaying everything that had happened, her heart heavy with the realization of how wrong she'd been about Shaq. By morning, curiosity had taken over. She found herself standing at his doorstep, eager yet hesitant. Shaq greeted her warmly and led her to his car. They drove in comfortable silence until they arrived at a small homeless shelter. Janice's eyes widened in disbelief as she took in the scene. A long line of people, their faces etched with hardship, waited patiently for their turn to receive food from a modest stand set up near the shelter. "These people already have so much to worry about," Shaq said. "The least I can do is make sure they don't go hungry." Janice's chest tightened. Watching Shaq's selfless kindness, she felt something deep within her shift, her distrust, her guarded outlook. It all seemed so small in the face of his generosity. She blinked back tears as they drove away, her perspective forever altered. That day marked the beginning of a transformation for Janice. She started volunteering at the shelter, finding joy in helping others. Slowly, she began to see the beauty in the world, the goodness in people she'd once overlooked. Shaq's compassion sparked something extraordinary in Janice, and together they created a legacy of kindness and change, proving that even small acts of generosity could lead to monumental transformation. What a shocking reveal! What did you think Shaq was hiding in his house? What do you think about his actions?